Welcome everybody. To be successful in life or in business, it's important to have a vision of what the future could be like and what our role could be in that changed future. But it's also important to have a good understanding of actuality, what's actually happening, what's realistically possible, and what's frankly impossible. Key to a better understanding of actuality is data. That's not just an anecdote or two, or a rumor, or what's written on a marketing presentation. It's real data about company performance, market statistics, human preferences, and so on. Someone who has been collecting data for many years about technology startups and about companies that aspire to be innovative is our guest speaker today, Professor Jeff Funk. If you're not already following his posts on LinkedIn, you should be. What he writes there is often uncomfortable for those of us who have techno-optimistic aspirations, but it's invariably presented clearly and argued well. I'll leave it to Jeff to introduce himself properly in a moment. I'll just say that the first time Jeff and I met, according to my diary, was March 2004 in Shimokitazawa in Japan. We met to speak about how innovation had been very successful in the Japanese mobile phone market. In my notes from that meeting, I recorded that the Odakyu train company had been the first in the world to use phones as train tickets. And we also spoke about how market adoption had proceeded via young consumers before diffusing to business users. Well, that was 18 years ago, and not every industry is like mobile phones. So, Professor Jeffrey Funk, please bring us up to date. The floor is yours.
Good day to everybody. A pleasure to be here. Yes, we did meet 18 years ago, and I moved to Singapore in 2007, where I was a professor for many years, dealing not just the mobile phone industry, but a lot of other industries. And I taught a course on the economics of new technologies, where I dealt with a wide range of new technologies. And I remember being pretty optimistic in late 2000s, but by 2012 or so, I realized a lot of these were very far away. Things like nanotechnology and bioelectronics and superconductors for energy transmission, they were far away. And that was kind of the beginning of my pessimism that continued to get stronger as I saw the startups losing vast amounts of money in the mid-2010s. I began to realize that. So I've been following this for a long time, collecting data on startups and markets for new technology, progress in new technologies. And so that's what I'm going to talk about today. And so I'm going to show you my slides now. How's that?
Perfect.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to talk about startups, startup losses, cumulative losses bigger than Amazon ever had, and then we'll talk about new technologies. So market sizes are small. I'll talk about the progress is slow. And then in the end, we'll talk about science-based technologies and how there isn't any new. And over the last 50 to 7 years, there's been big changes the way applied research is done in the US. And I'm going to argue that's a big part of the reason. So most of you are aware that Silicon Valley is named after the semiconductors that were the first industry for which startups were formed in Silicon Valley 70 years ago. And we don't have anything like that anymore. And I'm going to argue that's a big reason why we don't have the startups, successful startups that we had many years ago. These are the biggest cumulative losses. So cumulative losses are just annual losses summarized, summed over the whole life of the company. You can see Uber with 31.7 billion, and there's a number of others. And I choose this $3 billion cutoff because that is what Amazon had when it became profitable in year 10. And I'm also going to say something about many of these startups are much older than 10 years. They've been in existence for more than 10 years. So we can see pretty big losses. if we compare these big losses to startup failures, the biggest startup failures, so some of you might remember that Solyndra, Republicans like to make a big deal out about it because Solyndra was a solar company that failed, and you can see it got $1.2 billion from VCs, and some of that was money that was provided by the U.S. government. So the U.S. government provided some, I think, some type of loan guarantees. And there's some other ones listed here. And basically, I'm going to say that none of today's can compare with these companies here. So these are the 224 largest startup fails. I'm just putting the biggest one. I distinguished between before 2015, which is Solyndra, Abound Solar, Better Place, and more newer ones, Quibi and Katera. You might also know Webvan, which people made a big deal about when it failed 20 years ago. Okay, so if you compare the funds raised with that 1.7 billion, there's a lot of them are much bigger. All the ones in red are much bigger. There's a few that are in black that aren't much bigger, that are smaller than that 1.7 billion. But all the red, most of them are bigger. So I have the cumulative losses there too, but you can see the funds raised. So it's quite likely that many of these startups are going to go bankrupt. So as the interest rates rise, well, it's inevitable that it's going to be harder to finance these huge debts. So it's going to take a little while for that to happen. But as interest rates rise and the stock prices go down for many of these companies, and so some of these have very low stock prices. I'll show you some stock prices later. This is a scarier metric, I think. So what I compare the cumulative losses to the revenues in 2021, and 77 of 140. So there's 140 publicly traded unicorns. There's a lot that went out of business or were acquired, but of the ones that are still publicly traded, way more than half have bigger cumulative losses than their 2021 revenues. And why that's significant is because let's say a company even gets profitable. Let's say one of these companies becomes profitable and its profits are equal to 10% of sales. So it takes at least 10 years to erase its cumulative losses. So even if they become profitable, it's going to be hard to erase those cumulative losses. They're just so big. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so very pessimistic about these companies and startups in general. And you might ask, well, are they becoming more profitable? And here's some data. This is just annual profits, annual losses. So you can see that of the 140, the number profitable increased from 14 in 2019 to reach 2021, 19, but then it's gone back down. So the lockdowns were great for most of these startups because most of them offer e-commerce or cloud services, some type of service that really benefited from the lockdown. Gaming, the exception was ride sharing, but food delivery, on the other hand, very beneficial because, the revenue went up. So, but now the revenue is going down for most of these startups, or at least it's not growing as fast in 2022. So that's why there's fewer that are profitable in 2022. And even the stock market is pessimistic. So this is the Thomson Reuters Venture Capital Index, which measures how the stock prices of the venture capital of the unicorns, the publicly traded unicorns. I think it also measures the private valuations for the privately held startups. And it's about 2 weeks old, so it doesn't capture the last fall in share prices that have occurred in the last few weeks, last week or two. And one question that I've asked for a long time is, when will newest US startups reach the top 100 market capitalization? So I remember somebody telling me 25 years ago that it doesn't matter about the average startups. What it matters is whether a few startups have this big impact on the world that really become big and important. And so you can see the ones on the left. These are ones that were founded between 1970 and 2004. Right, they had a big impact. I think it's simple. It's easy to say. It's accurate to say that they had a big impact. They're in the top 100. market capitalization, and you can see the market capitalization. You can also see that they became profitable very fast. Other than Tesla and Amazon, they became profitable very fast. They also reached, some of them reached the top 100 very quickly. Google in year 8, Facebook in year 10. I think there's another one, Qualcomm. Yeah, Qualcomm's year 14. But none of the ones founded since 2005, none of the ones that we're talking about today that we ordinarily call startups have reached the top 100. Even though they've certainly been in existence for as long as some of the company, as many of the startups were when they became members of the top 100 capitalization, market capitalization. And only a few of these are profitable. So it says year of existence, and our year of existence, you see some blue numbers. That's the year they became profitable. So 4 of them have had annual profits, but they aren't all annual profit. They're not profitable now. So Coinbase and Block have actually gone unprofitable this year in 2022. And you can see that one company is in the top 200, Airbnb. 3 others are in the top, are additional ones that are in the top 300. Then all the rest way down. So if you're looking for a big winner, someone that's really changed the world, well, maybe you think Airbnb is that, but there's not a lot there. So that's another reason why I'm pessimistic about these things. Now, a big question for me is, for a long time, has been, what about the privately held startups? So we know there's these publicly held ones, and we know there are profits and losses because they have to release that data. So that's why I'm able to present it here. But there's also privately held startups, and you ask, well, are they profitable? Well, we don't know, but we can kind of guess that the most profitable startups went public first, right? There might be a few privately held startups that are profitable, and for some reason they haven't gone public. But for the most part, we can probably guess that they are worse off financially than the publicly held ones. So if the publicly held ones are losing money, then it's quite likely, which they are, then it's quite likely that most of the privately held startups are losing big money, right? And we know there's also been some dropping valuations, right? You see 3.5 trillion in total valuations in early 2022, but dropping. And what is their true valuations? Well, I'm not optimistic. I mean, 500 billion, you know, maybe, you know, even some of the big ones like Stripe, you can see Stripe's valuation dropped a lot. So it's probably not profitable. Why the huge losses? So there's a lot of reasons, right? We can talk about, you know, a lot of reasons, and we can guess. And the first question I'd ask is, do VCs care? Because they make 1 to 2% of their invested funds, so they make money on that. So whether even if the startups don't make money, they make money, and so they want to give out that money, right? They've got all this, they call it dry powder. They've got all this money that they could give out. Well, they want to give it out because they've charged some fees on that their invested funds. So they don't care. They're also able to make money through some of their IPOs and SPACs through greater fools. So, you know, the greater fool theory, there's always a greater fool than you. So if you can just find that greater fool, you can make money. And then someone's holding the bag is the greatest fool of them all. So even though these startups aren't making money, the VCs were able to sell them on and make lots of money. Too much emphasis on growth. So there's been a lot of discussion of that. The VCs are pushing growth and subsidize a lot of the sales. There's also endless copying of each other, right? We look and we see so many startups doing the same thing, ride-hailing, food and grocery delivery, etc. It's just endless, the same. And there oftentimes isn't very little difference between them. So, you know, if one is losing money, why should another make more money? More emphasis on value capture than value creation. This is, I think, a big one because there's a lot of emphasis on platforms. You know, we got a platform. And platforms always make money because that's what a lot of the academics have been saying. because some of the most profitable companies of all time, like of the last 100 years, like Microsoft and Amazon and Google, they're platforms. But when you talk about platforms, you're talking about value capture. You're talking about how you capture value. There really isn't a lot of meaning to a platform in terms of value creation. And that's kind of sad. We've kind of forgotten that, you know, it isn't just about stealing the money from the taxi cab drivers so that we can capture some value. It's about creating some value for the final users, right? Well, actually, it's creating value not just for the final users, but for everybody. And then you capture one portion of that value. It's not happening. We're not creating much value. And the biggest one, I think, is no new breakthrough technologies. I mentioned earlier the importance of semiconductors to Silicon Valley, and that's why we call it Silicon Valley, because semiconductors are the most commonly used semiconductor is silicon. And there isn't these breakthrough technologies that really add a lot of value, that really enable everybody to make money. And so that's what I'm going to talk about next, is unsuccessful new technologies, because they're not very successful. And so here's some data on market sizes for new technologies. And this is all in 2000 and I don't know, about 2020, 2021 numbers. For comparison purposes, I put all this 1990 and 2000 numbers. I put them in 2000 and 2021 dollars. And you can see that personal computers had a huge market in 1990, and a number of other technologies had a huge market in 2000. 2010, there were a number that were big. So I have smartphones because the 2012 data was easier to get than the 2010 data. But you look at 2021, and none of them have big markets, right? Drones, VR, AR, they're very small. I think the biggest is AI there with 58 billion. Now, these are just digital technologies, I should say. That's what I've kind of focused on. But many new breakthrough technologies like nanotechnology, bioelectronics, think of Theranos, semiconductors for energy transmission or energy usage, none of these are succeeding. Right there, none of them have anything close to $100 billion. And we should, if science was really working the way it's supposed to, the way it did 57 years ago, those would have big markets. There's also slow progress. So some of you may be thinking, well, they have small markets now, but they're going to grow. And I know people have been saying that for years. And I want to talk a bit about progress, because I think it's a lot of people misunderstand or are unable to really talk intelligently about progress. Is a technology experiencing progress? A lot of people will look at AI and other technologies and say, oh, there's just so much progress, so much stuff is happening. And usually what they mean is there's so many papers being published, so many patents, there's so much noise, right? But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about actual progress in performance and cost. You know, if you go back to desktop computers in the 70s, you know, the first personal computer came out in 1975. Within a few years, word processing spreadsheet software was available. I remember people talking about it. I didn't buy one of those personal computers. I mean, I was 20 years old in 1976, but a lot of people were big on this stuff. And, you know, people knew that this was important. Word processing, they knew how long it took to type documents, how hard it was to edit them. You know, we all knew that. We all had to type documents. Spreadsheet software, so even though we had calculators could not work as well as a spreadsheet software. So there was things before Excel. So right away we saw, right, it was clear. I mean, that is real value. And when Amazon released books, right, when they started selling books online, I mean, a lot of people looked at that and said, this is value. I can't find the books I want. I go to the bookstore, and the bookstore only offers a small number of books. I remember going to Powell Bookstore in Portland, Oregon in about 1995, and they had like 2 million books. There was one in Long Beach, California that had 1 million books that I also visited before that. But those are rare. So the value of Amazon was clear so quickly. You could buy something that you could not get in the normal bookstores. Yeah, you could order it, but it took a lot of time. It was hard to search for the books. There wasn't a way to search it. You had to know what book you want. You'd call the publisher and they would mail it to you. So most people saw this is big value. This is what we call value. And different firms capture different amounts of value. And that's important. But the biggest issue is creating the value. That's what we lack today, is creating this kind of value. And then if you look at the progress, right, it was very rapid, because we all know that personal computers benefited from Moore's law. So there were these dramatic increases in processing power, and now allowed the computers to process more complex and feature-filled software. So the initial word processing spreadsheet software was very simple, but Moore's law enabled suppliers to make that software more complicated. It also enabled enterprise software. The same thing happened with e-commerce and Amazon, is that there were increases in internet speeds. So initially, fashion and cosmetic suppliers said, we're not selling anything on the internet because it degrades our product. These lousy pictures, and sometimes there isn't even a picture. So they waited. They waited until there were pictures, there were videos. But this came about because of the rapid progress in internet speeds. And so when we talk about today's technologies, this is what we're looking for. We're looking for that initial value, and we're looking for rapid progress, right? But we don't really find it, right? We look at VR and AR. Virtual reality goggles are not getting smaller. They did at one time, but they don't get smaller anymore. Users become nauseous. I don't think there's any evidence that nausea is being reduced, or certainly not being eliminated. And why? You'd say, why? Well, why can't we make this progress? Well, it's because of this theory of physics that says there's a trade-off between size and field of view. All you have to do is look at the field of view and the size of Google Glass and HoloLens goggles from Microsoft, right? You see that Google Glass has a very small field of view, much smaller than the goggles from Microsoft. So this involves optics. You can't improve it through Moore's law. Very hard to improve it, apparently, without breaking the laws of physics. I mean, there are some physicists who say, yeah, we can break it, we can do things. And even the website that I got this from said, well, we can break it. But we don't see the evidence of progress in terms of making these things smaller. So that's what I mean. When I don't see the progress, then I'm very pessimistic, because this is very different from what we saw with past technologies. Things like computers, things like e-commerce. And the same thing with delivery drones. We don't see the progress that we need. You know, some people tell me, well, they can fly faster. Well, but that's not the bottleneck, right? You have to think about the economics of delivery. It's more economical in high-density areas. So any of these delivery trucks, they work better in these high-density areas because they don't have to drive as far for each delivery. And they can deliver something to your next door neighbor right before they deliver it to you, deliver something to you. But the problem is that these downtown high-density areas have high-rise buildings, right? So now this is what we're talking about with drones. We're talking about, can a drone deliver something to the 33rd floor and pass it through the window to you? Well, it probably is technically feasible. It's just not very easy. It's going to cost a lot of money, and nobody's doing it yet. And I don't see the progress. I don't even see the discussion, but that's really what we need when we talk about drone delivery. If drone deliveries are going to become really big, you know, you might say, okay, well, we can't do those high-rise, but let's do it in less dense areas. Well, the problem is that although they don't have high-rise buildings, they oftentimes have above-ground power and telephone lines. So America is terrible for this. Above power and telephone lines are rarely underground in America. In Singapore, where I live, they're all underground, but it's very dense here. It's very densely populated. So there are places that have them under the ground that don't have high rises. Well, yes, maybe in those places the drones will be able to be used, but in most places, no. And I don't see the progress. I don't see progress on these drones to be able to do these things. Self-driving vehicles, right? This is one of the most argumentative technologies around. right? And so we know that it's hard to make them as safe as human drivers because of this devilish problem of edge cases. So there's thousands and thousands of situations that we humans have learned to handle, usually just through becoming an adult, recognizing things. But teaching machines to understand these edge cases is very slow, right? Some people say we need 99.9999% accuracy with self-driving vehicles. That's very hard to handle. It's very hard to make a system that robust. It takes many, many years. It took decades for the human-driven vehicles to become as safe as they are today. Many, many years of improvements in roads and vehicles. And so that's one of the reasons why I say there's slow progress in self-driving vehicles and why I'm pessimistic about self-driving vehicles. But the biggest reason I'm pessimistic about self-driving vehicles, I don't see any progress towards increasing the capacity of a city so that it can handle more robotaxis. And what does that mean? Well, we know that ride-hailing increases congestion in cities. It reduces the travel speeds. So cities that have introduced ride-hailing can handle a smaller number of vehicles than they could handle before ride-hailing started. Now imagine if there were no private vehicles, they were just all robotaxis. Imagine that. We'd have so much congestion. We have a lower capacity. Cities would be handling a smaller number of vehicles than they used to be able to handle. Now, how many cities do you think are going to allow that? How many cities can say, "Oh, that's great. Yeah, we've got robotaxis, but we can only handle 70% the number of vehicles that we used to handle. So you have the 30%. Sorry, you're going to have to somehow find another way to work." So I don't see the progress here. Now, there's more progress with big data and AI. So in combination, AI, one estimate was 163 billion. So this is pretty big. But the problem is that there's a huge backlash to many of these types of applications, right? So I remember reading Kathy O'Neill's book 6 years ago, Weapons of Math Destruction, right? Playing off the WMDs. These things don't work well. And you look at progress towards making them work well. Progress, what's the progress? The problem is that if you want to increase the accuracy, and this also holds for self-driving vehicles, if you want to increase the accuracy of AI from 99 to 99.9 to, or actually just 90 to 99, and then 99 to 99.9, and so on, you have exponential increases in computing power required, and all the other things that come with it, like carbon emissions and things, and cost. So I don't see the progress here. I see the progress in augmentation, right? And so that, I think, is going to happen. You're going to see a lot of augmentation with AI. But the startups that are commercializing these AI big data don't have big market capitalizations. There's only 2 publicly traded startups that I could. By the way, this is mostly U.S. data. I'm mostly focusing on the U.S., but big losses exist for foreign companies, whether they're Indian, Chinese, or European. See, 2 billion each. This is a very, very small market capitalization. If we include big data and other aspects of data analytics software, only CrowdStrike and Snowflake are among the top 500 firms in terms of market capitalization. So remember, I talked earlier about the firms with the highest market capitalization and how today's startups don't have high market capitalizations. Whereas startups of many years ago very quickly reached the top 100. Okay, so these are some of the things that I see as make me pessimistic about technology. Very small markets and very slow progress. And the other thing is that when you look at today's tech, it isn't giving us what we need. Right? What do you mean? Cheaper and better housing, transportation, food, appliances, or more reliable electricity grids? We don't have those. Less energy usage? These are things we need. There's a whole set of things we need. So that's why I call the bubble today, I call it the unproductive bubble, because the bubble, the dot-com bubble, gave us a lot of great things. It gave us e-commerce. It gave us Amazon. It gave us a lot of great startups, a lot of great technologies. You know, the internet is great. There's problems with it, but it's great compared to what we're getting now. So I call this the unproductive bubble. There'll be a few things come out of it, like Airbnb and you know, maybe, just maybe, Uber will become profitable. I doubt it. And there's probably, and Zoom, and there's a few others. But in general, I consider it the unproductive bubble. So why are the markets so small for new technologies, right? And of course, a lot of these questions, the first three questions are the ones that a lot of business professors are trying to ask. You know, they're implementing them the wrong way. Should we be implementing a different way? And I agree they should be. I mean, I could tell you stories about how ride sharing can work better and how, or I should say ride sharing algorithms, because I'd really be talking about applying them to public transportation, public buses, but also how self-driving vehicles work in a better way. But it isn't a way that the auto companies want. Maybe they're focusing on the wrong customers' applications or using the wrong design. So right there could be a number of reasons. Perhaps they're emphasizing monetizing data is misplaced. You know, stop focusing so much on platforms and start focusing on good value proposition. There's probably a way to do these things better. But there's a lot of startups out there, and yet they aren't working. And a lot of incumbents are trying to implement them. So, you know, maybe they're just not that great, or maybe it's just they're years away. You know, it could be a lot of reasons. So the next topic I want to talk about is really about science-based technologies and why there isn't any. So what do I mean, you know, by science-based technology? So I can show you some examples here. It's technologies based on advances in science. So the 40s, 1940s, 1950s, 1960s were great for these technologies, right? There's a long list of them. And of course, transistors to integrated circuits are the obvious one. So we call it Silicon Valley. So there was, and many scientists won Nobel Prizes from this, from the research that enabled these technologies. So this was great. But then if you look after that, and if I've made a mistake here and left something out, well, you can tell me. OLED displays emerged in 2010, right? So there was improvements in them over decades, in different colors and things, and more luminosity per watt, and smaller, and there's a lot of improvements. But the first OLED was discovered in 1950s, a long time ago. Electric vehicles, yeah, I admit that's a big technology. That's probably the best new technology of the day. I admire Elon Musk for it, for doing this, for being able to do something that all the incumbent automakers tried to do, but couldn't, and somehow he did it. They came from these improvements in lithium-ion batteries, but the science for that was done, science was done a long time ago, 1970s and early 80s. But nevertheless, I would call these three examples of science-based technologies coming out recently, although I would say that solar cells are really, they were actually first developed in the 1800s. It was that there was a key paper written in the 50s by someone at Bell Labs that then caused these solar cells to become much better, more widely used. So they were used in satellites starting in the late 1950s, early 60s. But the science is very old. So improvements in best laboratory efficiency really kind of almost stopped in the 70s and 80s. There really hasn't been much since then. That was really the end of the science age for solar cells. So we look here and we don't see much. So it's a hard question, you know, why so little, right? And so now I'm going to do more speculation about why I think this would be. And I say it's speculation because I can't prove it, and I realize that there may be things that I haven't thought of, but I think it's important to think of these things. I think that there's been big changes in America's system of applied research. So at one time, back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was mostly companies doing this applied research, right? So a lot of these technologies that are failing today, these science-based technologies, nanotechnology, et cetera, there has to be a lot of improvements before we can commercialize it. You know, academics have this view that, oh, no, you have an idea, and then the academics, then the companies try to commercialize them. No, a lot of these technologies have to be improved over decades before they're ready to be commercialized. And it used to be that corporations had this did this applied research to improve these technologies. But now corporations have taken a step back, universities have taken a step forward, and most of this research, this applied research, is being done by universities and basic research. There was a lot done by corporations like Bell Labs. And how do universities do research different than corporations? Well, one big thing is they have an obsession with papers, right? There's millions of papers published each year in so many journals, right? There's H factors, there's H indexes, there's lots of these things, right? It's an obsession with them. And there's also lots of journals, and which leads to hyper-specialization of research. So I'm going to talk about some of these in the next few slides. So the change from corporate to university research. So back in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there was a lot of big corporations that had central labs that did a lot of basic and applied research, and I list some of them here. And you can also look at surveys done by the late Edward Mansfield. He was an academic social science researcher who looked at research. 50s, 60s, 1950s, 1960s, 1970s, 1990s, 1980s, he did some surveys of companies to figure out what were the industries most benefited from academic research. And as you would expect, semiconductors is a big one, computers, but there were also things like materials, like steel, chemicals. So people forget that 40 years ago, the chemical industry was considered a high-tech industry. We wouldn't call it that now. They had central labs and developing all kinds of things. So a lot of it was the outgrowth of the polymers in the 40s and 50s. And there were a lot of Nobel laureates from these companies. Now you can see the number, 11 from Bell Labs, 5 from IBM, 3 from Motorola. And this research continues with Nobel Prizes. So the physics and chemistry prize awarded since 2010, you see here, many of the recipients, right? 9 of 17 recipients did research corporate labs. Now, part of the reason for that high number is that very few Nobel Prizes in chemistry, physics, and biology are awarded for work done past 1990, for research done after 1990. There's some, like gene editing and things like that, but most are not. Most of it's awarded for stuff a long time ago, right? There's a problem here. This scientific research is not coming out as fast as it used to be. And so I'm trying to explain why that's so, because I think that tells us a lot about why new technologies aren't growing very fast and why startups aren't making money. So, you know, university research, which is now considered more prestigious, you know, it's literature searches, paper writing. It's a lot of activities that aren't really important to commercializing new products. This is a problem, right? If we want to have new products, we're going to have to do the kind of research that leads to new products, not the kind of research that just leads to papers. And so we have some, here's some quotes from Kathleen Carrico, who works for Moderna. Actually, I'm not sure which one of the drug companies she worked for, but she received an award for her work on the vaccine. And you can see it. She actually had lost her academic position because she wasn't able to publish enough papers, right? So she was doing this RNA, looking at RNA to develop these vaccines, and she's quite negative on the way academic research is done. So obsession with papers, right? More than 3 million articles published in more than 42,000 peer-reviewed academic. That's a lot. That's a lot. That's a lot for research. Papers with more than 100 authors are not uncommon. You know, they don't get read. These papers don't get read. And on peer-reviewed not being in until people forget how much has changed over the last 70 years. So research was done so much differently. It used to be that the editor of the journal read the papers. Right? Could you imagine how specialized? The editor wouldn't be able to understand all these specialties. But these specialties have been created. We've created these specialties. So this is the problem. And the type of papers also changed. So hyper-specialization. What do I mean by that? Well, professors are so specialized because all they do is try to publish in, a few journals. So the number of journals has been rising. Actually, there's data on this for hundreds of years. They've been rising very steadily for hundreds of years, but this is just data, more recent data. And for me, it's these big ones, these number of journals published by these major professional organizations. And the one that jumps out at me all the time is Nature. So there was one Nature magazine in 1970, just one. Now we got 157. How did we ever survive with just one Nature magazine? Right, all the great work that I showed you that come out in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, it came out in this era when there were so many fewer papers, so many few journals. There was only one Nature journal. It's amazing. And it's can we expect something from this type of hyperspecialization, right? Because if you're going to come up with a good idea, you have to be able to integrate information from a lot of different sources, a lot of different disciplines. I say journals here, but what I mean is disciplines, different disciplines. You need people from disciplines working together, but you need people to understand the different disciplines, or else how are they going to be able to work together? So I'm ignoring all these, the fact that most researchers don't know anything about manufacturing, marketing, accounting. I'm ignoring that fact and saying just the sheer number of specialized disciplines that we have now, it's very hard to come up with something new, because it's very hard for specialized researchers to understand all the disciplines that go into the technology they're developing. And of course, all of these papers, all of these journals, this leads to huge bureaucracies, right? Right, the number of PhDs is like 10 times the year that they were 50 years ago. Someone's got to manage them. Someone's got to manage the postdocs. Someone's got to read the dissertations and draft papers. Someone's got to write the grant proposals, right, along with letters of recommendation. These are things that people have to do. You run a big lab, you got to do this work. So even if you're a really great scientist, you're probably not doing science, you're probably doing administrative work a lot. So this is the problem. So it's very hard for a new Silicon Valley to be formed because there isn't any of these technologies. And why isn't it technologies? Because we've changed the way we do research. Okay, so I'm not going to really tell you much about how to fix these problems. I'm not going to be able to tell you how to fix the science problem. That's the hardest one. I can sketch out things, but it's very hard, right? So I know a lot of people are hoping that we don't have to do these things, right? Can't we just find startups that without changing the way we do science? Well, maybe, but remember that most of the big technologies that really changed our world, they came from this. They were based on advances in science. So the semiconductors that formed the formation of Silicon Valley, even e-commerce, right? The internet came from glass fiber. There was a guy who won a Nobel Prize in it. He did the work in Great Britain at an industrial laboratory. He figured out that pure glass fiber was necessary to have fast speeds in the glass fiber. It had to be pure. There were people that did develop these lasers that are able to. So the internet, the semiconductors, they're all come from these advances in science that occurred a long time ago. We're kind of still living off them. But we have to create new ones if we really want to have great startups like we did 50 to 70 years ago. So I'll end on that note, and I can take questions if anybody wants questions. Let me see. I don't think I have another one, do I? No, that's it.
Many thanks, Jeffrey. There's a really powerful set of messages there. Could we start with just confirming that there are potentially large markets for at least some of these technologies? It's not all chasing small margins. So if we look at Moderna, one of the positive examples you highlighted. It's not as profitable or as valuable as some of the other companies you touched on, but it's offering mRNA vaccines, which have been very gratefully received, and it's toying with the idea of mRNA vaccines for cancer. I shouldn't say toying. So if such a breakthrough were to take place, drawing on breakthroughs in science, also involving a heck of a lot of engineering, there presumably would be a pickup for such a market.
Yeah, I probably didn't emphasize that enough. There are some profitable startups. So you mentioned Moderna, Zoom. There's some e-commerce small ones, Etsy and other ones. So yeah, there are, and certainly Moderna helped us get over the pandemic. So that was something worthwhile. But a lot of the and so yeah, let me just say that is worthwhile. Yes, I agree with you. There are a few success stories, but I wouldn't describe the Moderna vaccine as a breakthrough. I suppose that the use of RNA was new and different. So maybe what your point is that somebody else is going to use RNA to develop other forms of drugs. So that may happen.
I think that's what Katalin Kariko and her team were hoping. They were developing for a long time what they hoped would be vaccines against cancer, and it turned out to be too complicated. As you reported, she had grief from her academic supervisors at the time, and she lost her position, but thank goodness she kept on going. And that's still a very promising line of work. And what we need to discuss is what's preventing it from succeeding. I don't think there's an argument that there could be a very large market for it, were it to be successful.
No, there could be. I can't say that I'm an expert on RNA, so I'm not going to try to answer that question. I'm sure there is a big market, but whether it's going to be realized is a tough question to answer.
Yeah, we could say the same about Theranos. You know, Theranos is in everybody's bad books, of course, because of all the terrible things that happened there. But the market position it targeted could be very large if the technology would have worked. Namely, that with a small pinprick, the multiple blood tests could be done without having to put the system in somebody's arm.
Well, except that there isn't much there. There's a lot of startups trying to do that, and they're a long ways from being able to do that with that small amount of blood. And if you read the articles about Theranos and people and scientists commenting on what Theranos was trying to do, Theranos was trying to do something that was promising something that wasn't possible. So right, you look at progress. So again, progress, right? You want to look for progress. You want to look for, some small success story, and there isn't a lot, right? We live in a world now where the smallest of successes get just pushed all around, right? They get trumpeted all over the place, and we don't even see any small successes in this bioelectronics. So, and if you don't hear this about the successes, well, then these small successes, then I have a hard time believing there's large successes.
Let's take a question from Richard Baker, who I think very sympathetic to one of the points you're making. He asks, is the challenge that VCs and universities find themselves compelled to demonstrate short-term results, hence issuing papers on a regular basis, and if you don't do that, then you fall down the league tables in various ways. So Richard's question is, if that's the case, how can we encourage longer-term thinking and longer-term investment?
First of all, the willingness of the VCs to put up with huge losses and to keep funding these startups suggests that they suggest long-term thinking. More money has been spent on these, huge amounts of money have been pushed onto these startups to subsidize their losses, to cover their losses. So you could argue that's long-term thinking. we could also claim that the investments of startups, of VCs in nuclear fusion, in electric V2OLs, right, vertical takeoff and landings, that's not really a science-based technology. But there's a whole set of synthetic biology startups. These are all long-term. I would say that in some ways, we have an experiment occurring right now that to develop these nuclear fusion, other technologies that never existed before. We have VCs thinking more long-term than they've ever thought before, in that they are saying, okay, we're willing to fund these things for years before they make a profit. Quantum computers is a good example, right? VCs are pouring tons of money in quantum computers. So the willingness of VCs to take risk is higher than it's ever been. But the problem is, you see, that I think it's being done wrong. What we need is, we need somebody to be making the underlying improvements. Somebody. I'm not going to say who, right? It should be a university, but the university is too busy publishing paper that they're not really concerned about improving the performance and cost of them. We want someone, could be an alliance of firms or somebody, improving the performance and cost of these technologies many years before they get commercialized. And that, during that stage, there should be a broader sharing of data, maybe not to everybody, but still beyond a single firm. So I think we're in this today we have bigger risks being taken by venture capitalists than ever before.
So it's not that they're too short term. It's that there are other issues that need to be addressed. The lack of corporate labs.
But let's talk. That's
VCs.
Yeah. I want to say something about universities, because you might say they're short term because they're just concerned about how many papers they get and whether they got funding to keep everyone in their lab employed. Right. There are other ways to do things. You don't have to just count the number of papers. We have funding agencies. That's what they do. They count the number of papers and say, oh, we got a lot of papers out of that project. Wow, it was a great project. Well, did the project bring the technology any closer to commercialization? No, not really, but that isn't even thought of. It's just, I've got a lot of papers published. And so that's very much short-term thinking, as opposed to thinking, okay, in order for this technology to commercialize, we have to achieve these levels of performance and cost, and we need to meet some milestones every year to move towards that. And we're going to find the people who can do that. And we're not going to evaluate them every year and say, oh, you didn't get a paper published, oh, no more money, or you got a paper published, oh, you're great, we'll give you lots of money. You begin to look at these milestones, and you begin to move money based on that. A much more long-term type of measure than just counting the number of papers published.
So have you studied what was the incentive structures inside the corporate labs that you talked about and talked positively about, the Bell Labs, Motorola, and so on? Were they incentivized and motivated by different mechanisms from the groups you've talked about just now?
Well, the way you got famous in those days was you commercialized it. You had to make it happen. You just couldn't publish papers. You know, some people published papers, and there were people who did that. But there was a whole set of people who were, they staked their career on making something happen, and making it and commercializing something. It's kind of like commercialization doesn't happen anymore, so we don't hold anybody responsible for it. We've kind of said, okay, it doesn't happen, so we don't care if it doesn't happen. We need to get back to those intermediate milestones. So there was a lot of concern about those things. About companies are oftentimes much more concerned about cost and performance than our universities. They're looking at these things, and there's managers saying, well, how close are we getting to those levels of performance and cost we need to publish to commercialize the technology?
It's sometimes said that the best university environments nowadays aren't in universities anymore. They are inside the likes of Google and Facebook and Microsoft. They have attracted many of the brightest academics, and they give them more leeway. They don't pressurize them to publish on a regular basis. They take a little bit more long-term view. What's your assessment of how well they're doing?
Yeah, that could be. That could very well be. But remember that most of these companies are doing only researching one kind of technology, AI. Right? America doesn't have how many companies in America do materials research? You know, how many big materials companies are the leaders in research? You know what? You have a lot of these big companies are not in the U.S. anymore. They're in Japan. They're in South Korea. I don't even know about Europe, but right. If you were to say, okay, in America, let's have America and Europe work together at trying to commercialize nanotechnology, new forms of solar cells, new forms of displays, new forms of bioelectronics like the Theranos kind, superconductors. You know, who would you ask to do that? You know, how many firms are there even left? So yeah, maybe Google's doing that, but only for AI. All these other technologies, right? All these companies kind of backed out. All the chemical companies backed out of this research. The materials companies, I mean, U.S. Steel and Alcoa used to be, and GE used to be big in plastics, right? It's backed out. So we don't really, so what Google's doing, as you say, may be better than what the universities are doing, but it's just for AI, right? And we really need to have companies doing research on a much broader set of scientific technologies.
So if you were approached by advisors to the EU, and the EU said, you know, we want to carve out our own path in the world. We don't want just to ape Silicon Valley and do what they're doing, nor do we want to follow what China's doing. Would you therefore advise them get into some of these fields like bioelectronics and materials, and say there's something there that's not being addressed by existing national schemes?
Yeah, I think both Europe and the US need to put together alliances of firms, and they would probably involve both Europe and the US, because you can't do it on just a national basis anymore. Alliances of firms in which some of the money comes from the government. So as opposed to the government just giving basic and applied research to universities to write papers, you're matching, or I don't know what the actual way of matching the funds, but you're providing funds to do basic research that's shared among those firms, and then hopefully those firms will then commercialize something based on that. Because I think we need to move away from this paper mentality. We need to move back to a technology mentality, a cost and performance mentality, and be thinking about startups that are based on these kinds of technologies.
What you're saying reminds me of a very powerful talk I heard last week in Dublin. So I went there for a longevity summit, and there was a lot of discussion about this could be breakthroughs, but there's also discussion about why aren't more breakthroughs happening more quickly? Why are the promise that was made about longevity treatments 10 years ago still not as developed as we wanted? And there was a talk by the CEO of Hevolution. Hevolution is a new Saudi-backed initiative. They have a budget, they say, of up to $1 billion per annum, or certainly $100 million per annum for up to 20 years. And Saudi Arabia, of course, have got quite considerable disposable wealth. The CEO of Hevolution has a long track record in pharmaceutical companies, and what his main focus was, well, we need more, he called it translational science. We've got these ideas over there, we've got some understanding of the market, but there isn't enough work to turn these ideas into real solutions. And he was saying they would be applying their funds to accelerate translational science. And one of the things he wanted was exactly what you said, more cooperation between pharmaceutical companies. For example, pharmaceutical companies often explore something, and when it fails, they never tell anybody about it because it's not in their interest to report bad results. And what that means is another pharmaceutical company can spend a great deal of time investigating that as well. And so rather than learning from a failure in one place, there isn't the pooling of knowledge. So this phrase, translational science, is it what you're talking about, or is it a different analysis?
No, it's very similar. No, I agree with that. I agree that we need to have some of the scientific research going on at companies. You know, it used to occur a lot more. You know, there was even there was a research paper about 1989 claiming that the big corporate labs in the world spent money on research, mostly so that they would be able to understand the new ideas come out of universities. Right? If you want to develop new drugs, well, you have to have some people in your company who understand the cutting edge research being done in universities. You can't just suddenly, right, have this thing presented to a bunch of executives and say, oh, yeah, well, I don't understand anything you're talking about. So you have to have these people. So I agree. So I think it is similar, that we need that kind of, those kind of alliances to make more of these science-based technologies commercialized.
A question from PNJ, who talks about improvements in power grids. Apparently, I wasn't paying enough attention at this stage, but you said that there are a few power grid improvements emerging. PNJ suggests that this is an infrastructure problem, and he is hopeful that when there is more smart meters rolled out in the UK, we've been a bit of a laggard in that aspect, then there's going to be much better analysis of the actual deployment, the dynamic loads, and so he's suggesting that there is a big progress that's pending there. It's a matter of time.
Well, I hope so. I don't know about that. I'm not familiar with that particular technology, but you know, I hope so.
And surely demand for improved energy storage. It's frequently said that renewables face the problem that they only generate electricity some of the time, and there needs to be ways to store the output. And batteries is one suggestion. There's other suggestions about pumping water up hills and letting it come down again. That strikes me as being inefficient, but apparently it could be made efficient. So there is surely a market need for it there. But again, it's a question of why it's happened so slowly.
Well, I agree that that electric vehicles are the most successful new technology of our time. You know, and my hat's off to Elon Musk. And those batteries are probably going to be used for storage, but you know, it's going to take a long time. You know, solar did great. And solar is great for handling peak usage, the middle of the day. But then we've taken it beyond that, right? So that we end up having to turn all these coal-fired power plants off and just run them at night. Well, then they don't run well, so then they get shut down altogether. So if we want to have an all-solar world, we're going to have very cheap batteries, and I don't know how long, many years it will happen, but you're right. The costs are falling. You know, whether we're going to get dramatically new batteries, new and better batteries, these solid state batteries, or there's all kinds of different materials they're using. Whether those are going to come out, that's a question. I think that part of the reason that they suffer from the same problems as other science-based technologies come out is that academics just want to write papers. They want to write papers, and they don't really think about, you know, what does it take to commercialize these technologies.
Let's talk about the deployment of technologies, which often requires multiple things to happen at the same time. This is sometimes said that it's called Demi-Moore's law. It's a bit of a joke that in order to have a technology working, you need to have several things working simultaneously. So Even mobile phones could not be successful until there were networks. Smartphones could not be successful until there were better networks and also application stores, and also applications and also development platforms and education for developers. So something like self-driving vehicles, maybe it needs more changes in the road system to allow it to go forward. So it may be that self-driving vehicles could be adopted in some new cities or in parts of some new cities.
My view on, I've had a very different view of self-driving vehicles for the last 8 years and everybody else. So, I mean, I took a transportation policy course in 1981. And the guy, I remember, said there's congestion. Congestion is the whole problem in transportation. How do you reduce congestion? It's almost impossible to reduce. We keep putting more cars on the road, and then they ended up getting too congested and nobody moves, right? And that's what Uber is doing to us. And so for me, self-driving vehicle technology shouldn't be applied to getting rid of the driver. The whole issue is to increase the capacity of the city's road system, to allow more vehicles to pass per time on the roads. Now, how do we do that? We have to get the vehicles to travel closer together and travel rapidly close together. So we don't focus on replacing the driver, we focus on having that communication so that we can have these vehicles travel close together. So it's a completely different solution. And so it's a different approach, but it's an approach that you can envision that then the technology is in the road, the technology in the system, it's not in the vehicle. Automakers don't want that. They want it to be in the vehicle, right? You're going to turn if you emphasize vehicles being communicating with each other so that they can travel closer together, that's a different set of technology than the vehicle working autonomously. It's a very different solution, because that's the fundamental problem, is congestion. And we have to be able to make cars move faster when they're close to each other.
Well, this is a very interesting point, because it says we should be thinking more about the end goals rather than just the technology. So we've got in our mind that there are advantages to self-driving cars, and we can easily imagine that it'll be more convenient not to have to pay attention when we drive. We can imagine that in principle, in due course, they'll be safer. But what you're flagging is a different target, and it's the target of being more efficient, less congestion, no traffic jams. And so Martin Bielecki has a similar question. He says that, again, shouldn't we be setting different objectives for the research and development, not so much just be profitable or get papers published, but Martin says everybody should be focusing on getting more years of healthy life, rather than all these other things.
Yeah, well, I agree. Going back to vehicles, you know, cities aren't really in charge of making the rules for self-driving vehicles. So like San Francisco is one of the first places to get them, and the San Francisco officials aren't in charge of that. The rules are made in Sacramento by the state, because the state has a Department of Motor Vehicles. Every state in America has a Department of Motor Vehicles, and that Department of Motor Vehicles determines whether self-driving vehicles can be used on the road. It isn't the city, right? And what we want to do is put cities in charge, so that cities implement a transportation system that works for them. And that's the way things looked like they were going to evolve like 8 years ago. I remember talking to Los Angeles city officials, because I had written about this pretty extensively, and it hasn't gone that way. They're all been pushed to the side. So in every one of these technologies, every technology, right, you have to find the right people, like you're saying, to be in charge, so that the right goals are set. If you just let the companies decide how everything's going to be done, they may not do it the way that we want it to have it done. And I think self-driving vehicles is a good example, right? Who cares if we've got a road system filled with all self-driving vehicles if the capacity of the system is, you know, only 70% of what it is today? That would be a disaster.
So in terms of the decision making, the decisions made by corporations, why did GE back out of the plastics and materials? Because you're saying it's a shame that that happened, and there should have been more research, and maybe we would have had better bioelectronics if they'd stayed in there.
Yeah, it's hard to say. I mean, all of these. It's hard to say why they backed out. My guess is that they backed out because they weren't getting anything out. And then, of course, when they back out, it guarantees they don't get anything out. It's not just GE, it's Dow Chemical and, oh boy, there's a number of chemical companies whose names I forget now. DuPont. Right, these used to be major companies in America. And things stopped coming out, so they stopped spending, doing research. And so it was a combination of both. Now,
they stopped doing research because the science had stopped producing interesting results. There was nothing more to be done.
Well, it's hard to say. If products weren't coming out, if interesting science wasn't coming out. I mean, you can ask what probably the biggest, most important chemicals to come out in the last 30 years are chemicals that are used in solar cells. That's a lot of that's come from chemical companies. The same thing with lithium-ion batteries. That was I think there were two or three of the three people who won the Nobel Prize were from companies. One was from Sony and one was from Exxon. And I think the other one was an academic. You know, those companies were doing this. So it wasn't just the chemical companies, it was the oil companies. They did this kind of work. They were doing a lot of solar work.
My question for you, Jeffrey, is where in the world are things better? You've mainly been analyzing the statistics from America. I've often heard it say that Singapore is one of the best places in the world for enlightened government policy. If not Singapore, is there anywhere else that you think may have a better potential for innovation that turns into genuinely valuable products?
The startup losses. Startups in every country are losing lots of money. In China and India, in Europe, and in Singapore. Singapore has Grab, a ride-sharing company with, I don't know, $15 billion in cumulative losses. Almost as big for Sea, this half gaming, half e-commerce company. It's losing big money. So it's everywhere that's doing bad at this. The startups are terrible. You know, South Korea, they're losing money. I suppose that we might be able to make an argument that South Korea and Taiwan are doing well because South Korea, right, in terms of semiconductors, solar cells, displays, South Korea is very strong. Taiwan is very strong. Japan is reasonably strong. I mean, they're all stronger than America. They're all stronger than Europe. And China is becoming stronger. So at least they have some companies there that do a lot of basic and applied research, or more so than America's companies. I mean, America, in terms of hardware companies, only has electronic hardware. You're talking Intel and Micron, I think. I don't think Europe has anybody, right? So you could say that some of these Asian companies are doing better, but I'm not sure about, I don't know how the collaboration with universities works. But OLEDs, right? That's all South Korea, and there were some universities involved. So you could say that they're doing better. I don't think that South Korean universities have jumped on the let's publish 5,000, you know, thousands of papers a year, like the Americans have.
I do remember that one of the previous South Korean presidents, Park Geun-hye, responded to DeepMind's Go success against the human player, who is also Korean, by urging much greater cooperation. This is about 2016, 2017, that the Seoul National University should be cooperating more fully with LG, Samsung, Hyundai, Naver, I think. Maybe the Korean search engine. So that was, at least for a while, a strong government policy. So is that what's helped there, or is it a more traditional culture?
It could be, I don't know. I haven't spent a lot of time in South Korea. I spent a long time in Japan, and there, a lot of the companies worked by themselves. They didn't work that much with universities. So I can't say about South Korea, but your point is important, that there is probably a better way to do this.
And that better way involves setting better goals, incentivizing groups in the short term with different incentive structures than what's happening today, having a realistic understanding of what's involved in actually producing products. I feel often we have been misled by autobiographies and biographies of great things that happened in the past, which maybe missed out on some of the reasons why these previous things were successful. And there's many people who say, Kennedy was successful, or America was successful with their moonshot. Therefore, all we need to do is to declare a moonshot, a bold, audacious goal, and we'll be more likely to succeed, without appreciating the enormous amount of engineering work that was done, testing out different hypotheses, figuring out which kind of rockets were appropriate, and figuring out which set of vehicles should detach and reattach in various ways as the preparations were made to actually land something on the moon. So I feel there is a misguided moonshot worship, or a misguided exponential worship, or a misguided innovation worship that doesn't have enough understanding of the full complications and skills required.
Well, a lot of the important technological change occurs outside of the main area. So Kennedy said that, but people forget that there was all of this rocket technology that came from Germany. They've been developed, or was under development for decades before we announced that moon shot. There was all the electronics that were coming to bed, all the integrated circuits that were coming together at the time. So Kennedy saying that, it's that, well, he got lucky because he was asking for something that was possible. And that's what's key, trying to understand what's possible. So that's why I talk about monitor progress, be able to look and say, is progress occurring, right? And if we find some progress, then we see opportunities. But I think that you're right. Too many people, they think that all you got to do is set big goals, right? So Biden announced some big goal the other day about cancer, something for cancer. And he you know, too many people think that it's stating some big goal and then somehow it's going to happen. When the hard part is the underlying technology that's being developed in a lot of different places.
I looked into some of the history of the moonshot project for something I wrote myself last year. And the Eisenhower administration and then the Kennedy administration both did a lot of research looking at the feasibility from multiple angles before they were bold enough to announce it to Congress.
Well, yeah. And that doesn't go on today, right? So I'm a big critic of the hype, because a lot of the hype is based on superficial nonsense. It's not based on actually trying to understand things in detail. And you're absolutely right. That's what we need. We need more policymakers to be looking in more detail. And the last 5-10 years, it's been so much superficial nonsense that's been pushed.
So how do you rate SpaceX against these criteria? SpaceX, they're launching rockets, reusable rockets via private technology that's taking advantage of prior science. Is that a good example?
Well, again, Musk has done something there that is to be complimented. He's done very well. Now, the problem is that we may not need so many rockets, right? All those rockets, launching all those rockets assumes that there's something we want to launch, send up in space, most of which is satellites. And that particular Starlink is, and it's an example of not a lot of progress, because you look at the number of subscribers, there's 500,000 or so, a little more than that. And you compare that, well, there was 12 million mobile phone subscribers in 1990. We're not even close to that, you know, much less the 8.6 billion mobile phone subscribers today. And yet there's already big reductions in the speeds that users are getting from Starlink because of purported congestion. So the rockets are great, right? He's figured out how to reuse the rockets, so that's a great a great technology, but it's not clear what we're going to use it for. You know, it's not like we're going to be sending a lot of people to the moon or to Mars. I know he wants to go to Mars, but you know, what's the reason for going there? People kind of say, "Oh, we got to go because we got to go." Well, we have to think of a reason. We have to think, well, are we going to? Is there some mining that's going to be cheap up there that allows us to bring something very valuable back? Is there some kind of processing that can be done in this very low gravity environment that's valuable? Those are the things that have to be thought about in a lot of detail before you send people up there. You can't just say, "Oh, it's so great to go up there," and say we did it. No, it isn't. It's great to achieve something that makes our lives better.
Personally, I look forward to being on Mars, but maybe not for 50 or 60 years' time. I think there's plenty of other things we need to do in the interim, which I would prioritize.
Well, I'm glad you're optimistic about your lifespan.
Let's take one question finally about centralization of high technology manufacturing. This is again by PNJ. So the idea is that, you know, because we've got some economies of scale by doing things centrally, we lose diversity, we lose independence of thinking. And I do notice that many of the good AI startups, one reason they don't grow in value is they're swallowed up at a fairly early stage by some of the big platform players, and sometimes they're genuinely interested in hiring for talent, so it's an acqui-hire. Sometimes they're just doing it to shut down competition. But is this centralization around a small number of very successful players counterproductive?
Well, you know, there's continued debate between centralization versus decentralization, constant changes. Some things are getting more centralized, some are getting more decentralized. When you think about innovation, you really want to have a lot of people involved. And there's fewer people involved, right? The whole startup system is controlled by a small number of people who give the money to a small number of people. It's a big problem. It's you know, and they've got all these bad ideas. And I'm sorry, but a lot of the spokespeople for the venture capital industry, I don't have a great deal of respect for. Mark Andreessen is always, I mean, I don't know why he's talking about Web3 and crypto and all this stuff. These people can't compare it to Andy Grove and Bill Gates and Larry Ellison and people who did a lot of great stuff, you know, 50 years ago. And so we've got it centralized around people who really aren't that impressive. You know, Mark Zuckerberg gets a lot of criticism too. He's just a young guy who just happened to get rich, and yet now he has all this power. Right? There's a big problem here. But there's no easy solution because it's just an outcome of capitalization. How are you going to change it?
Final question. How is your message being received, and how do you think you can get more of an audience to pay more attention to what you're saying?
Well, I certainly have a lot more followers than I had on LinkedIn than I had a couple of years ago. I've also got much more likes on and views on my posts. And then I get a lot of people telling me how much they like what I say. But I know at the same time, there's a lot of people who hate my guts, right? Because they just see me as someone who's pessimistic, and therefore increasing the chances that their startup, that their share prices are going to go down, their valuations are going to go down. You know, I'm part of the problem. And I think that a lot of people, you know, once they decided to make their career about innovation, they suddenly don't like you know, they can't do anything else. They're afraid. They're desperate. They're desperate that this whole thing's going to collapse, right? It's very possible that these share prices will continue to go down, the valuations will go down, that a lot of these startups are going to go bankrupt. You know, I'm sympathetic to these people that they have devoted their life to something, and there may not be that much more money, there may that much more funding for it. Right now, there's a huge amount of funding, but if you look at the VC funding after the dot-com bubble burst, it was the 2000, you know, until 2015, it was pretty small. It took a long time to recover. So
Richard Barker
You know,
asks whether you maybe not shouldn't be seen as pessimistic, but you're more like the little boy in the Emperor's New Clothes. You're pointing out things which most people are aware of, but they'd rather not have discussed. Is that
well,
the
I know
situation?
you're right. The industry has evolved this where people suddenly didn't like anybody who disagreed with them. They didn't want to hear about how it was complicated. They decided they were only going to hear from people who agreed with them. And it's very bad that the industry has evolved that way, that the whole innovation and startup system has evolved that way, where they basically don't want to hear any kind of criticism, they don't want to hear another idea. That's the sad part. They don't want to hear another idea.
Because what I like about your approach is you're not just critical, you are constructively critical. What you're saying is, well, there would be benefits if we could solve driverless cars.
Yeah.
There would be benefits from some of these other things, and we're not getting there by what we're doing currently. So,
Yeah.
but I wonder how many of the people who are liking your posts share that positive long-term intent, to how many of them are just negative and fed up with high-tech, and they just like to see high-tech and Mark Andreessen and other VCs get a bloody nose.
Yeah. Well, there are people like that. I know there are people who are just mad at technology in general. There are people out there like that. You know, going back a little further, I used to teach a course in economics of new technologies where I talked about these types of problems. I taught for years, and the course was very popular in the US. It was probably the most popular course in our program. I mean, I had, almost everybody took the course, even though it wasn't required. It was very, very successful, yet the professors all hated it because I was talking about technology. And you see, business school professors, I was in an engineering school, but we mostly had business school professors teaching the program. To them, it's the business model, it's not the technology. So they don't like it if you understand the technology, because they think you don't have to understand it. They think that, well, the technology, you got to figure out a way to implement it. It's all an implementation. And I'm saying, no, it's years of improvement before it gets commercialized. So you have to understand the improvements, whether they're current. You have to understand the technology and its good things and bad things to find that value proposition, to find those customers. So much of this is technology and trying to understand the advantages and disadvantages of technology and who in the world want this, right? There's all these people out there who are so different. Some people pay attention to price, some people pay attention to performance. And when you talk about business users, industrial users, they have so many different needs, right? And that's what I tried to talk about, what I would like to continue doing. But it's hard. Business schools, universities decided, no, this isn't it. We just have to have more, people that in the US who are still there, I know, say, oh, no, we just have more competitions. They try to come up with good ideas.
So what you taught in that course years ago is still largely relevant.
Oh,
I had a rumor
you're
going to turn some of it into a book one of these days.
Well, I have the book, but it's hard to get published, because I'm not in a university. It's hard to get it published. It's hard to, and
Right.
I'm very critical of World Without Work, Rise of the Robots, and these kinds of books. Academics don't like what I'm saying, and then I criticize universities. I say they pay too much attention to value capture and not enough to value creation and platforms and things. Now, of course, I'm not the only one that's critical. Most of my posts come from articles that other people write. The ideas are from other people, but it makes business people, it makes academics very angry.
Well, hopefully somebody watching the recording of this will feel inspired. They may have good links to a publisher or some other market outreach mechanisms. They should connect with you on LinkedIn, I guess.
Yes.
You pay attention to the messages you come in incoming them, and there's a lot of spam in my LinkedIn these days, but I'm sure you must find the signal in amongst the noise.
Yeah.
Professor Jeffrey Funk, you've been very cogent. You have raised attention to lots of data that many people might not want to look at, but we should look at it, because if we are naive, we're never going to build the better world that many of us hope to see. So thanks for raising our awareness. I wish you the very best with your research, and I look forward to continuing this conversation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, David.